Okay, that'll become more apparent in just a minute, and it'll be very important later. But we don't really care too much about his ideal theory, right? What we care about is what his entitlement theory, how it would work in our world, namely a world that actually does include injustice. Okay? And I think that if we apply his theory to a world with that includes injustice, here's what his theory will look like. So the first two principles will be the same, right? You have to obey the principles of justice and acquisition or transfer. What's different is this third principle. Third, a person who acquires a holding in accordance with the principle of the rectification of injustice in holdings is entitled to that holding, right? So if I, steal a carton of cigarettes from you and I smoke all the cigarettes before you can get them back, but we agree that if I give you my watch, my $50 watch, then that will kind of make restitution for the carton of cigarettes I stole from you. Then you coming to acquire my watch will have been an instance of you acquiring a holding in accordance with the principle of the rectification of injustice in holdings. Okay? And then in the actual world, then that would be it. Right, and then no one would be entitled to a holding except by repeated applications of those three principles. You either acquire it justly from it being unowned, or you acquire it justly from somebody who had a just title to it, or you acquire it by way of rectification procedures like the one we just talked about. All right, now that's all fine and good, but it's very abstract. I mean, what does it actually take to be entitled to a holding? What processes do I have to undergo? What criteria do I have to meet for me to be entitled to a holding? So according to Nozick, that's going to be entirely a matter of how the holding was acquired. And I think the general picture is going to look something like this. Very roughly, according to Nozick, a person or institution or whatever kind of thing can kind of be entitled to hold property. They acquire entitlement to a particular holding, X, right? And a holding is just anything you can own, right? Anything you can have title to. A person or institution A acquires entitlement to holding X if and only if the following conditions obtain. A, nobody was previously entitled to X, and 1, A claims X, right? It's as simple as that, as I understand Nozick, right? He gives the example of, suppose you go to the beach and you pick up 1 grain of sand from the beach, and you say, this is mine, henceforth. And you put it in your pocket, and you go home with it. Okay? Nozick seems to suggest, for reasons we'll talk about in a moment, that you're merely claiming that grain of sand is good enough. It's in combination with these other conditions, sufficient for you to become entitled to it. But it's not only that's not good enough, right? In claiming a given thing, you have to make sure to leave enough and as good for others, right? Maybe it's okay for me to take 1 grain of sand, but I can't take all the grains of sand in all the beaches in the world, right? Or, thinking about it in a meadow, like an apple orchard, right? I can take like 1 apple from 1 apple tree, and that apple's mine now, because everybody else has enough opportunity to get apples for themselves, right? I haven't prevented that, so that's important. But sometimes I can still become entitled to a holding, even if I haven't left enough and is good for others, but only as long as anybody who's left worse off by my appropriation has been adequately compensated, right? So in the apples case, right, I suppose I don't just take 1 apple, but I claim to appropriate the entire apple tree, and it's the only apple tree in the area. Now, it might be okay if I do that, but I have to make sure, since I haven't left enough and it's good for you, for the rest of you, I have to make sure to compensate you in some way. Okay. All right. So if nobody was previously entitled to X, and I claim X, and I leave enough and is good for others, or I compensate those left worse off, then X is now mine. I now am entitled to it. The other way I can acquire entitlement to a holding is suppose that I get it from somebody who was previously entitled to it. Well, then I can become entitled to it if that thing was voluntarily given to me, right, by somebody who themselves was entitled to that thing. And they give it to me, for example, as a gift or by way of contract, right? Like we trade for this thing, or you give X to me as payment for services rendered, or whatever, right? And my acquisition of that thing leaves enough and is good for others. Or if it doesn't, I compensate people who have been made worse off by my acquisition of that thing. The final way that I can acquire a legitimate claim to something, or I can become entitled to a holding, is if it's given to me as a part of a procedure, a legitimate procedure of the rectification of injustice. So think about the watch and the carton of cigarettes. So these are the ways. These are how I actually acquire entitlement to a holding. Right? I claim it. I claim an unowned thing, and I leave enough that is good for others, or I compensate them, or I get something from I acquire title to an already owned thing by way of voluntarily being given that thing, either as a gift or as a piece of an article of trade or whatever, or I get it by way of processes of rectification. All right, so hopefully that gives you a little more detail than just the general theory off to the left there in the box. So I just want to say two quick things about this. I mean, obviously there's lots more areas that we could fill in here, right? There's a lot of questions we could ask, like what is enough and is good for others really mean? What is adequate compensation? What are good principles of rectification? Right? All these things are very important. Nozick says some interesting stuff about them in this piece, but not a lot. But there's lots of questions we can ask. But I just want to say two things that are especially important here. As we noted, right, I only acquire a title to an owned thing by way of voluntary transfers, right? Like if I coerce you into giving me the thing, then I do not have a just title to it, right? Or if I deceive you into giving me the thing, I do not have entitlement to it. All right, so deception and coercion make transfers involuntary or unjust. And then the other important thing, this is a big deal, is that any uncompensated or unrectified injustice in the entire history of a holding makes it so that one is not now entitled to that holding. Right? The actual history of how people came to have the things that they do is what's important for Nozick, as we'll talk about more in just a second. All right, but we can already see that just laid out in this general theory here. All right, so now we know roughly what it takes to acquire entitlement to a holding. Oh, sorry. Just do a little interlude with John Locke. So as you all learned by reading the Nozick selection, Nozick was very deeply influenced by John Locke on these issues. So Locke is a famous 17th century philosopher who actually came up in a Rawls lecture too. He was kind of influential in a number of ways. He's one of the kind of most important of the British empiricists, right? People who think that we acquire knowledge of the external world primarily by way of our sense experiences. But he was kind of probably best known for his political philosophy, and his most influential work in political philosophy was the Second Treatise of Government, which came out in 1689, the time of the English Revolution. And one of his many goals in that piece was to try to explain how individual people could come to have property rights in external things, right? Things that were previously either unowned or were owned in common by all. Now, if you let yourself just reflect on that for a second, it's a very difficult task, right? How in the world could I come to acquire these kind of profound rights in things that were just out there in the world for everybody to use, right? How could I acquire the right to exclude others from the use of it, right? So this is one of Locke's main concerns. And Nozick does a really nice job, I think, of kind of laying out some of the key parts of Locke's view and some kind of issues that it faces. But just in case you're curious, I've uploaded chapter 5 of Locke's